Section 1. Introduction. Millions of indigenous people called the Americas home long before Europeans arrived, and labeled North and South America the New World. While new to Europeans, this land had inhabitants for millennia before colonization. By the time Europeans crossed the Atlantic, native people spoke hundreds of languages, built diverse political systems, created cultures adapted to hundreds of distinct environments. Human beings lived and loved and lost. Kinship ties knit ancient indigenous communities together over distance, time, and space. Each community possessed unique art forms and spiritual practices, and participated in extensive trade networks where they exchanged items such as salt, pottery, shell jewelry, and even bison meat. Political units ranged from small family units to vast empires. These continents teemed with life. Massive piles of discarded material, including shells, testify to past ways of living. Other communities were careful to leave no trace. Because there was no mention of North America or its peoples in the Bible, many Europeans were confused by its existence. Spanish missionary José de Acosta, 1540 to 1600, was puzzled over where the continent's indigenous people had originated. Even more puzzling were the diverse kinds of peoples and cultures that the Europeans encountered. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, Tenochtitlan, later Mexico City, rivaled the world's largest cities. The Spanish could scarcely believe what they saw. 70,000 buildings housing perhaps 250,000 people, all built on a lake and connected by causeways and canals. Spanish soldier Bernal Diaz del Castillo later recalled, "When we saw so many cities and villages built in the water and other great towns on dry land, we were amazed and said that it was like the enchantments." What was foreign for these new arrivals had emerged over vast stretches of time. The origins of America begin with its first inhabitants and their many cultures, polities, and lives. Section 2. First Americans. Indigenous peoples recount origin stories in the form of maps, inscriptions, paintings, wampum belts, or other weavings. Other historic tales are told through dances, songs, or story cycles told on specific occasions. All transmit sacred knowledge of previous generations to the ears of current-day listeners. The many different creation stories reflect the diversity found within indigenous cultures and polities. These stories serve as both history and testaments to the power and endurance of these communities. The origin stories of land, plants, and animal relatives are equally important, as are the stories of human emergence, as they teach about the interconnectedness of all beings. Cherokee people explained that long ago, before humans, the sky world was inhabited only by animals such as rabbit, bear, and possum, which were much bigger than they are now. When sky world became too crowded, all the animals gathered in council and decided to explore the waters below to look for land. Only Dionysi, the water beetle, could dive deep enough to bring up mud from the underworld to make an in-between world, Elohi, where everyone could live. According to a Lenape, Delaware tradition, the earth was made when Sky Woman fell down to the watery world and, with the help of beaver, goose, and muskrat, landed safely on the back of the great turtle. Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, people teach that Sky Woman brought tobacco and strawberry with her from Sky World. As she danced, the clay under her feet expanded to become the earth. This is Turtle Island, or North America. Indigenous American stories hold thousands of years of information, and most are specific to the places from which they come. For example, Utes explain how the Creator once gave Coyote a bag of sticks, with instructions not to open it until he reached the mountains. When Coyote disobeyed, people came streaming out, speaking many different languages. Coyote closed the bag again and took it to the mountains, where the Ute people were the last to emerge. Some stories recount how people came into existence through the process of migration. For example, Anishinaabe families placed their origins on the waters of the Northeast, but tell of being led by a megas, white shell, to their homelands where food grows on water. That food was manumin, wild rice. Traveling by canoe and dog sled, the Anishinaabe family paused in 7 different places, including on a turtle-shaped island and at the rapids of Bawading, Sault Ste. Marie, where Great Beaver built a dam between Lakes Huron and Superior. At this place, the Confederacy of the Three Fires was born: Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. Indigenous stories of creation and migration, passed down from generation to generation, contain remembrances and instructions for relationships, obligations, and ways of being. They also speak to understandings of power and connection. Kinship relationships, in particular, have enabled the adaptation to changing environments and the preservation of this complex history. Whether emerging from the earth, water, or sky, formed by a creator, or migrating from elsewhere, current-day Indigenous American communities recount histories in America that date long before human memory. Section 3. Beginnings and arrivals. Conventionally, archaeologists, anthropologists, and climatologists have focused on migration histories and to understand America's past. By studying pottery fragments, tree rings, genetic signatures, or ice cores, for example, they have constructed a story that claims the Americas were once a new world for all. These scholars' ancestors, the majority of whom arrived in the Americas over the last 5 centuries, assert a different kind of timeline for human presence on the continent, one that is not without its own historical and political context. On many points, Western and traditional indigenous knowledge sources converge. Oral, linguistic, ecological, archaeological, and genetic evidence illustrates a great deal of diversity, with numerous groups migrating, settling, and traveling, potentially from many different points of origin over thousands of years. Results from combined archaeological, linguistic, and climatic data, for example, emphasize the arrival of 2 distinct yet diverse ancient founding populations from what is currently Siberia and Asia. Western scientists estimate that these people arrived along the Pacific coast between 24,000 and 15,000 years ago. Around 1,000 years later, overland arrivals began, followed by more coastal migration around 12,000 years ago. Low sea levels exposed the continental shelf along the northern Pacific Rim, an area called Beringia, named after the waters of the Bering Strait that would later flood it. This was an open area of exposed seafloor stretching over 600 miles across, which hosted different species of grasses and other low vegetation. Giant fauna grazed across the volcanic steppe tundra landscape, crossing back and forth between the places now called Siberia and Alaska. North of the Bering Strait, the East Siberian Arctic Shelf, which crosses the Central and Eastern Siberian Arctic, was also a potential route for transarctic crossings. Indigenous ancestors took advantage of the lower sea levels to navigate along and between the Pacific Rim Islands, following the currents and marine life, to arrive on the northwest coast of North America. Then, a 2,500-mile stretch of ice from the Bering Strait to current-day Washington state. There is evidence of early landings and migrations elsewhere as well. For example, fossilized human footprints at White Sands National Park, in what is now called New Mexico, point to humans walking there 23,000 years ago. As the climate became increasingly warmer and wetter, about 19,000 years ago, glaciers around the globe began to melt. Ice sheets up to 2 miles thick experienced cycles of freezing and thawing, creating new landscapes with new lakes and valleys. Vast amounts of melted freshwater flowed into the oceans, raising sea levels and creating new waterways. The warming planet and glacial terrain meant that ice-free lands could host new plant, animal, and human life. Some indigenous travelers followed their 4-legged relatives onto these newly dry lands. Around 16,000 years ago, indigenous navigators crossed the seas and voyaged along the largely unobstructed and island-rich Pacific coast, settling where local ecosystems permitted. As these skilled ancestors piloted the ocean waves and inlets, they located coves and rivers with plentiful fish, shellfish, and other marine gifts, as well as pathways further inland. In the coastal Pacific Northwest, native groups lived alongside salmon-filled rivers and celebrated the generosity of nut-bearing trees. They used nets, dams, and traps to fish, and then dried or smoked their caches. At Haida Gwaii, an archipelago off the coast of British Columbia, people fished, hunted whales and seals, and traveled in cedar log canoes. As sea levels rose, some indigenous ancestors moved inland to escape the floodwaters and find new food sources. On the tundra, plains, and prairies, hunting communities followed caribou and bison herds, moving according to seasonal patterns. Following great riverways also led inland. The Columbia and the Snake in the Northwest, for example, led to the headwaters of the Upper Missouri Basin in the mountains of today's Montana and Wyoming, and the waters flow from there to the Lower Missouri and Mississippi. In the Southwest, archaeological evidence points to settlements in central Texas around 14,500 years ago. At this time, coastal mid-Atlantic forests would have comprised a rich ecozone of grasslands, with a mixed variety of coniferous and deciduous trees, including spruce, pine, birch, and oak. Evidence also records human settlement off what is now Maryland's eastern shore on Parsons Island around 14,500 years ago as well. Further south, the shallow wetlands of the Gulf Coastal Plains served then, as now, as a rich biome for waterfowl and aquatic life, and provided a myriad of ways to navigate the region, whether on foot or by dugout canoe. Archaeologists believe the Na-Dene, the ancestors of the Apache and Navajo, or Dene, traveled the Bering Strait between 10,000 and 8,000 BCE in small bands of hunter-gatherers, before eventually traveling to what would be the American Southwest. Archaeological evidence indicates that around 3000 BCE, the next wave of migrators were the ancestors of the Aleut and Inuit peoples, who would eventually relocate to the Aleutian and Pribilof Islands of current-day Alaska. These were times of rapid change that required adaptability, careful observation, and skill to respond to extreme climates. The Great Plains provided grazing areas for large animals like bison and mammoths, while the colder weather further north opened areas perfect for other mid-sized mammals like caribou. Despite the disappearance of most megafauna by this time, the abundant fish and wildlife, such as bear, deer, possum, rabbit, raccoon, and squirrel, as well as nut trees and berries, made for accessible food sources. Indigenous hunters developed sophisticated techniques for hunting bison and caribou in drives, which required the cooperation of large groups rather than the efforts of individuals or small bands. Those large animals that survived the end of the glacial age, bison, caribou, elk, moose, pronghorn, mountain goat, mountain sheep, and muskox, were hunted seasonally and socially, providing more opportunities for family, cultural, and material exchanges. These people built social and political arrangements to coordinate hunting and to organize their relationships. Before the end of the last glacial cycle, a period about 11,700 years ago, indigenous ancestors crossed the ice, waters, and exposed lands. Some traveled in small, nimble bands, while other groups seasonally expanded into larger communities with more developed political structures. In mountains, prairies, deserts, and forests, the cultures and polities of America's first peoples were as varied as the continent's geography. Indigenous peoples made their lives alongside the rest of the beings in their environments, moving and changing according to their own desires and needs. As the climate began to stabilize around 6,000 years ago, indigenous communities began to leave behind more physical traces of their presence on the land. By the medieval warm period, around 950 CE, indigenous communities found it easier to increasingly turn to agriculture to meet both their nutrition needs and to help maintain political structures. Agriculture made settlement and the creation of cities possible, and indigenous leaders seized on the possibilities of agriculture to secure their power. By the end of the 15th century, indigenous populations in the Western Hemisphere would reach 100 million, with 2/5 in North America. Meanwhile, the population of Europe was only around 50 million. Section 4. Continent-wide changes. In the Mississippi Valley, indigenous ancestors long enjoyed abundant fish and wildlife along the river. Rivers and streams that fed the Mississippi slowed, allowing silt to build up, creating the rich alluvial plains that would later be known as the American Bottomlands, renowned for its agricultural potential. Moreover, as the weather extremes that had characterized so much of early indigenous life abated, summers became longer and rain more predictable. As a result, people who had mainly been foragers, hunters, and fisherfolk found it more feasible to cultivate domesticated plants. These choices made by indigenous leaders had considerable social and political implications. Indigenous women especially contributed to the growth of agriculture as they learned to domesticate wild plants and cultivate new ones. Some communities developed what has been called the Eastern Agricultural Complex, where wild plant relatives were selected and managed into larger and more dependable crops. Others continued to practice mixed and seasonally dependent ways of making their lives by combining the gathering of wild foods, hunting, and fishing with deliberate cultivation. Today, 10,000-year-old bottle gourd seeds in Florida tell of the people who carefully tended and harvested the crop. Further south, evidence of some of the earliest plants to be grown has been found in the caves of current-day Mexico. There, preserved ancient specimens of chili peppers, avocados, prickly pear cactus, squash, beans, and maize reveal what the community members were growing. Indigenous farmers also supplemented their diet with rabbit, deer, fish, and other wild relatives. Agriculture served a variety of political structures. Ancestors of the Menominee created an agricultural site called Anaim Omot in northern Wisconsin around 1000 CE that served individual families in a largely decentralized egalitarian society. Corn, climbing beans, and winter squash were grown intensively on raised fields. Other communities used agriculture to enable larger, more hierarchical political structures. The Maya in modern-day Mexico and Central America were the first to care for a species of wild grasses to cultivate into maize, corn, as early as 8,700 years ago. These farmers identified, observed, and selected the largest and hardiest of these plants, pollinating them until their kernels and stalks grew bigger, taller, and stronger, eventually creating a plant similar to the corn we know today. Knowledge held by one indigenous community eventually found its way to others, and maize spread to the Gulf Coast area around 6,000 years ago. It was high in caloric content, easily dried and stored, and on Mesoamerica's warm and fertile Gulf Coast, could sometimes be harvested twice a year. Maize required complex irrigation systems, leading to further agriculture development even in the more arid climates of North America. At what is now called Watson Brake, Louisiana, 5,400 years ago, Indigenous peoples began creating possibly the oldest monumental earthen architecture on the continent. The structure comprises 11 earthworks connected by ridges into an oval formation that is nearly 900 feet across. The sophistication and precision involved in these projects speak to cultural creativity, technical expertise, and political coordination. In addition to hunting deer, fishing, and foraging for nuts, the people also raised some of the earliest wild crops on the continent: goosefoot, knotweed, and marsh elder. Other foodstuffs eventually domesticated in the Mississippi River Valley included sunflowers and gourds. Later, in northeastern Louisiana, Indigenous travelers and traders began to work on an immense space of public architecture known as Poverty Point. Over a period of 600 years, people used basketfuls of dirt to create a complex of concentric, crescent-shaped earthworks that aligned with celestial configurations. This sacred geometry, carried out with the help of an extremely accurate measurement system based on equilateral triangles, was later used across the eastern Mississippi Valley. Although hundreds of people lived among the earthworks, the site seems to have been most important as a place of trade. Artifacts and stone materials recovered there have come from as far as 800 miles away, from the Appalachian Mountains to the hills of Iowa. Artisans decorated stone and ceramic pieces with images of owls, other birds, and panthers. Rather than a farming community, the people at Poverty Point gathered nuts, seeds, and wild fruits. They fished and hunted turtles, deer, and alligators. The residents also used cooking balls, small clay spheres that, when heated and covered, could be used to cook meat. Around 4,500 years ago, in the area along the current borderlands of southwestern Texas and northwestern Coahuila, artists in the lower Pecos Canyonlands painted scenes in red, black, yellow, and white on the walls of rock shelters and shallow caves. This rock art, featuring panthers, deer, human figures, serpents, and geometric shapes, holds stories and knowledge sacred to the peoples of this place, and is a reminder of their presence today. In those days, bison ranged across much of the continent but concentrated on the Great Plains, the largest grassland in North and South America. A warming climate led to a longer bison breeding season and the expansion of short grass prairie, perfect for bison sustenance, even during periodic drought. Roughly 4,800 years ago, indigenous peoples began making pemmican, a food consisting of pounded and dried bison meat mixed with fat and berries. Pemmican is particularly suited to seasonally mobile lifestyles because it serves as a complete, portable, and lasting energy source. In the Pacific Northwest, the Kwakwaka'wakw, Tlingits, Haidas, and hundreds of other communities speaking dozens of languages thrived in a land with a moderate climate, lush forests, and many rivers. They depended on salmon for survival, and this important relative was treated with respect. Its image represented prosperity, life, and renewal. Salmon images decorated and continue to decorate poles, baskets, canoes, oars, and other tools. Each season, as salmon were spotted for the first time, the coastal Salish people and others celebrated the first salmon ceremony. Sustainable harvesting practices ensured the survival of salmon populations. Massive cedar canoes, as long as 50 feet and carrying as many as 20 men, also enabled extensive fishing expeditions in the Pacific Ocean, where skilled fishermen caught halibut, sturgeon, and other fish, sometimes hauling thousands of pounds in a single canoe. Around 3,200 years ago, in the highlands of the regions now called Veracruz on the Gulf Coast, Olmec people were growing maize, along with avocado, cacao, beans, squash, and yucca. Olmec people made rubber balls from the latex of the local rubber tree, which they used in a ball game that became popular across the Mesoamerican region. Besides the ball game, Olmec society produced many other notable inventions. They developed the long count calendar, which was among the first mathematical expressions of the concept of zero, and would be used later by the Maya. Olmecs developed a writing system more advanced than those in Europe at the time. Their artwork included colossal busts made from volcanic rock. These monumental stone sculptures often depicted rulers and weighed up to 40 tons. The Olmec also carved masks and smaller figurines from greenstone, jade, and clay, with distinct coffee bean-shaped eyes. Their trade networks reached across the Isthmus of Mexico, and their artistic styles were imitated for hundreds of years.